Okay, so it's just 7:01 now. I think we'll start to get started. People can maybe joining us as we're going, and that's okay. I would like to again remind everybody if they could please keep their cameras and microphones off to maximize the experience for watching the video. The video we are going to watch today is called An Exploration of Beaver Pond Ecology. So if you're here to watch a different video, maybe it's the wrong chat, I don't know. If you have questions, we would love to talk to you about them and to answer the questions after the video. There's a chat window, I think it pops up on the right. If you look along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for chat. There'll be security options, participants information, and then there's like a little chat button. If you click on that, it opens a window on your right, this side, with conversations. So you can send a question either to the whole group or to me directly. If possible, if you could send any questions to the group as a whole, to everyone, so that everyone can see that the question has been asked and we don't have duplicate questions, that would be preferred. What other things did I want to see? If there are technical difficulties and for some reason the video is not playing, I have an email queued up to send to the group with a link to watch the video on YouTube. I've already uploaded it to YouTube, so I can send everyone the link and you can log off of this call and watch it since you're at your computers already, and then click back into the Zoom and we can do Q&A afterwards. I'm not projecting that that's going to happen. I think as long as everybody keeps their cameras off and microphones off, it should work out fine. This webinar is also being recorded, so we will share this link to the recorded webinar along with the Q&A, probably on our webpage sometime in the next day or two. So I would like to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sue Cope. I am the environmental director for the Lyme Land Trust. I've been with the Land Trust for about 4.5 years. I do live here in Lyme with my husband and our 2 boys, along with a couple dogs and a couple chickens and a fish. And we live a pretty simple life. I do work from home. So if anybody happens to walk in behind me, please disregard. They know mom's on a call right now. I do feel very fortunate to have found the Lyme Land Trust and to be given this opportunity to work with them and to help to preserve and protect our beautiful little town, and to also connect the community to the natural world that's around us. I think it's a very special opportunity. The Lyme Land Trust manages 112 properties across town. We have 69 private landowner easements and 43 fee-owned properties that we manage. In total, we have over 3,100 acres of land and water resources that we manage, which is awesome. So this video here is called An Exploration of Beaver Pond Ecology. It was produced by us, the Lyme Land Trust, and it was hosted by the fabulous local naturalist, Michael Zarfos. Though we will touch on beaver life, this video is not focused on beavers, but instead on the wonderful and surprising vibrancy that is found in the forest after a beaver dam and pond is created. So I would like to introduce you to our host, Michael Zarfos. He is going to give you a little bit of an intro on the video. I'm going to give a stab at introducing you, Mike. He is a PhD candidate at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He is originally from Deep River and sits on the board for the Deep River Land Trust. Michael's enthusiasm for nature is infectious, and if anything, he has inspired us to want to learn more. We are very excited and happy to be working with him. Walking in the woods with Michael, it's very easy to lose track of time and maybe even lose track of the trail. But he zigs and zags through the understory, and he oohs and ahs at the plants that maybe you or I might have walked by 100 times. But his perspective is very refreshing, and his knowledge and curiosity for the flora and fauna around him are just undeniable. So without further ado, I give you Michael.
Thank you, Sue. And thanks everybody for showing up watch this video. I'll try not to take too much time away from that. But I had a great time working with the Lyme Land Trust over the last, I guess it's been about 2 years now. I did a guided walk at one of the preserves, and then COVID hit, and we talked about maybe filming something instead of doing an in-person walk because of COVID. And we made one video, and that was pretty cool. And then we made this video. And it's been a joy to work with Sue and Joe Standart and Wendy throughout this whole process. All I do is walk around and, like Sue said, point at things and talk about them. So we did set out to talk a little bit more about beavers in this video than we ended up doing, partially because I just got distracted by many plants. But we do touch on them a bit, and we do show you some of the features of the beaver pond at Hartman Park. If you're interested in more stuff about beavers, I'm not a beaver biologist by any means, but I could answer questions about them at the end of this session, or the plants or the ecology of the park in general. So I hope you enjoy the video, and thank you for supporting Lyme Land Trust.
All right, thank you, Michael. So I'm going to play the video now. Please make sure that your cameras and microphones stay off. If we do have technical difficulties, I will come back to you and let you know to check your inbox. And again, if you have any questions that you would like Michael to answer afterwards, please type them into the chat box. And what other reminders? I think that's it. I think we're good. Let's try it. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. And I'm going to press play. 28 minutes. See you at 7:36. Bye-bye. Is it playing? It's not playing. There we go.
Good morning. My name is Michael Zarfos. I'm a PhD candidate at SUNY ESF, studying conservation biology, and a local naturalist. I'm here today with the Lyme Land Trust at Hartman Park. This is a park owned by the town of Lyme, but it's contiguous to land trust property and state property. Great example of the effects of cumulative efforts at conservation to create a mosaic of conserved space. Hartman Park is a wonderful place to come with your family. It used to be a series of farms. There are old stone walls here and remnants of the community that once lived here, including the Three Chimneys site. And there's an interpretive trail called the Heritage Trail. And if you find one of these guides from the Lyme Land Trust, you can walk that trail and learn more about the property. It's a wonderful place to check out. This is all secondary forest. As I said, the stone walls, some human-made dams and chimneys are all evidence of an agricultural past, but this land was never as good as the western lands for agriculture, and so as our country developed, people abandoned agricultural lands in Connecticut and New England, and they moved to more fertile soils out west. And then the forest, which had been previously reduced and cut down, grew back, and that's what we have to enjoy today. So I'm very fond of plants, so much of this walk will involve us looking at different plants and getting to know them, especially in their fall colors. As you notice, the leaves are starting to change. But there's also an extensive series of beaver dams and ponds that dot this landscape, and we'll take a look at those features as well. Well, we've only gotten a few feet down the trail so far, and we've already found a cool plant. This is American jump seed. It's in the family called Polygonaceae, which is the knotweed family. You might be familiar with the invasive Japanese knotweed, but there's many different species in the knotweed family. This is a really interesting plant. It can grow in tremendous shade, and you might see it in people's gardens occasionally, or on the edges of gardens. It's not something to be worried about. It's native. It's called jump seed because of the dispersal of mechanism for its seeds. These can be dispersed. They can hook onto an animal's fur, but they can also be dispersed once they're mature enough by ballistic style dispersal, where they're flung up to a meter or so away from the plant. And I'm just going to show you how, see how easily ejected they are? When my fingers bump into some of these seeds, you'll see them popping right off and flying away. So this is the dispersal method. This is how this plant gets its seeds away from itself. Obviously, if it was just dropping them right on the ground around it, they would germinate, and then it would be competing with its own offspring. And so it makes sense that it would disperse the seeds as far away from the plant as possible. So some characteristics that'll help you to identify American jump seed. One is just these long structures that the seeds are born on. They're pretty distinctive. The seeds look like they're little hooks, but the leaves are also pretty distinct. Unfortunately, we've got a little bit of herbivory on these leaves, but you might notice some mottling. There's some mottling to the color of the leaf, so we've got darker patches of green and lighter patches of green. On some individuals, you'll get something called a chevron, which is sort of a dark, I don't know if you'd call it a heart shape or a splash of dark color on the leaf. That's not universal in the species. It just sort of depends on the conditions. We've got simple leaves, so there's no teeth to the leaves. They're covered in a fine fuzz, and they're sort of oval shaped with a tapering pointed tip. So that's American jump seed, really cool plant. So right next to our American jump seed, we have a really cool fern. This is called marginal wood fern. Why this is called marginal wood fern is the position of these reproductive structures called the sori. These are full of spores. This plant produces via spore, not via seed. But the sori are located right on the margin, right on the edge of each of these pinnules. And so it's called marginal wood fern, Dryopteris marginalis. Really beautiful fern. While we're here on the water's edge, we should probably point out a couple of the interesting plants around us. So one of the plants, I don't know if you can see it all that well, is this one, this shrub. It's a woody shrub called sweet pepperbush. And I believe the reason it's called pepperbush, it's not because it has the flavor or scent of pepper. It's because the remnants of its fruits look a lot like peppercorns. If you look at that, if you've ever ground your own peppercorns, this kind of looks like peppercorns. The plant has somewhat oval-shaped leaves that are wider toward their tip than they are at their base. They kind of widen out and then quickly taper. They've got prominent veins and teeth. The leaves can get much larger than this. This leaf is very small because it's in direct sunlight. But this plant, while you see it right here growing out in the sun, can take an enormous amount of shade. So you'll see big thickets of this growing on the edges of watercourses and ponds. And because it can take a lot of shade, and because it's deer resistant, it's a great plant for your garden. It produces, these earlier in the season would have been white flowers, beautiful white flowers. It can grow in almost any condition. It spreads if you're trying to create a barrier via stolons, so these stems that grow just under the surface of the leaf litter or the soil and pop up new plants. So if you're looking for a native plant that is friendly to pollinators and birds for your garden, sweet pepperbush is the way to go. These are called emergent plants because part of the plant is out of the water and part of it is in the water. And what we're looking at right now, you'll see an arrow-shaped leaf, and this is called pickerel weed. So there are quite a few lookalikes to this. There's water arums and arrow-leafed plants, but pickerel weed, the arrow-shaped leaf it's very moderately arrow-shaped. So you see that the leaf recurves back on itself to create this heart or arrow shape, but it's not particularly exaggerated. And so what's really cool about this plant for people is that the stems are edible, the seeds are edible. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out and eat these things because oftentimes our water bodies are not, they can be polluted. So you want to be pretty cautious about eating aquatic vegetation. And the other really cool thing about these and all of the emergent plants that we're going to see is that they're growing in water, period. Now we think of plants as really liking water and needing water, but in reality, too much water can be a bad thing, largely because it means that the plant's roots are not exposed to an adequate amount of oxygen. They can be growing in a hypoxic environment. So the way that these emergent plants deal with this issue is through a spongy tissue in their stems called parenchyma. And that tissue allows them to exchange oxygen and other gases between the atmosphere above the water and their roots below the water and in the mud. And this is so dramatic in its effect that it actually creates oxygen. It pumps some amount of oxygen into the soil just around the roots and creates a habitat for bacteria and microbes that need oxygen, where in most cases the mud in aquatic environments won't support those. So that's pickerel weed. And if you look just beyond the pickerel weed, just to the right of this patch of grasses and beyond this rock, you will see a very large American bullfrog sticking its head out of the water. They are the largest frog you're going to see in Connecticut. Most frogs will eat just about anything they can fit in their mouths. And they're really beautiful creatures. If you look at the eyes of this creature, you're going to see the most amazing gold color that you're ever going to probably see in nature. It's really beautiful. So these are really special creatures. They're amphibians, which means that they breathe through their skin. They can live in an aquatic environment and spend some time on land, but only a limited amount of time. They need to be in the water, unlike reptiles, which have scaly skin and lungs, reliant entirely on their lungs for respiration, and those can spend more time on land. All right, so we just found a real treat at Hartman Park. This is an American chestnut. So the American chestnut was once a really important tree in the overstory community of New England forests and all the way down the Appalachian mountains. It's related to the American beech, but a blight came through from Asia and killed off all these trees. So this was an important tree. It produced food in the woods. Think about chestnuts. Chestnuts are big fruits. It produced a lot of important, valuable timber, and it's all gone now. So a lot of our trees that are impacted by invasive diseases, they're either fading or they're reduced, but this is largely gone. These were massive, massive trees. And so the only remnants that we see today, or many of the remnants that we see today, there are still a few big trees around, but for the most part, are these sprouts coming out of the stumps of trees that were killed off by the blight. It'll get maybe 30 feet tall if it's lucky, and then it'll die back again. And so the reason I know this is a chestnut is these really long lance-shaped leaves with very large, sparsely distributed teeth on the edges. So we've got these teeth, they're huge teeth, and they're pretty pointy. And the leaf itself is very long and exaggerated. This is an American beech leaf. It looks kind of similar. It has sparse, big teeth, but the leaf itself is fairly short and stout, and the teeth are not quite as long and pointy and exaggerated as those of the American chestnut. The bark of this plant is covered in fine dots called lenticels. Those would not be obvious on a large tree. The large tree, I think, has big vertical cracks and strips, very exaggerated strips, but you're not going to see many examples of that. So American chestnut, really beautiful, amazing tree. So now we're down on the Beaver Dam now, fresh Beaver Dam that's up above where the mill used to be, up above several different paths. And you can see it's fresh because of all the mud that's on it. So there's lots of fresh mud, there's clods of vegetation. So you've seen probably videos of beavers, you know, swimming up to a dam with a couple of sticks in their mouth. That's probably what you're really familiar with, but there are videos out there of beavers coming up onto the land, sort of clinging to, you know, a pile of rocks and mud, and then just plopping it down onto the dam. And so that's how they get this big stuff up here. We've got vegetation, we've got mud, we've even got rocks, which is really remarkable. And so, you know, random plants, and so they're building this really significant structure all day, every day. As long as they are living in a pond, they will continue to add to their dams and to add to their lodges over time. It really never stops. And so this is a new habitat here. This whole berm that I'm sitting on, this is all the dam. You can see over to my left how the land falls away, and there's a stream down here. So that really gives you an impression of just how big this dam is. At one point, it's probably 4 or 5 feet tall. And these things can get even taller than that. So this isn't a giant dam by any means, but it's a pretty significant one. And so why I mentioned the size of it and its components, these woods and muds and other materials, because it creates an amazing substrate for different plants. So we have a bunch of really cool plants growing right on the dam. We have a nettle, Urtica would be the genus. I'm not entirely sure of which nettle it is off the top of my head. It's not stinging nettle because it's not hurting me. There are some wood nettles. These tend to grow in wet spots, in seeps or wetlands, or in fields. Nettles, really, really cool plants. Some of them are edible. Then we've got a Burr marigold over here. Bidens is the genus. These are harder to get to species. We would need a key and to measure some of the flower parts. But a big, heavily dissected plant, lots of little stems and little flowers. The flowers are yellow. They look like little marigolds. Really twiggy plant. Whereas the nettle has these oval-shaped leaves with very pointed tips and very distinct regular teeth. And the leaves are very deeply veined. These very complex small flowers are very typical of the nettles. And then over here we've got a really beautiful plant. Again, we're not going to try to get the species here because there's several to choose from and they look fairly similar, but this is a bone set. It's got a very hairy stem, with clusters of white, beautiful, delicate flowers at the end. But what tells me it's a bone set and really sets it apart is its leaves. So you'll see that the leaves on either side of the stem actually attach and completely subsume or consume the stem. They surround it, which is really neat. But you can see that it's as if the stem grew straight through a double-sided leaf. It's really dramatic. And it's called bone set because in traditional medicine it has been used as a concoction to speed the healing of bones that have broken. So that's bone set. And one other plant that we want to get quickly, it's I just want to cover it now because it's very accessible to me, is this water shield. So here we've got, this is not the water shield, this is the water shield, this small lily pad looking thing that would be growing on the surface of the water. And what's really cool about water shield is the gelatinous substance that covers all of its submerged parts. So it's got this gelatinous substance, and this is actually eaten in some Asian countries. So this is an agricultural product in China and Japan. They use it in soups. It's called a mucilaginous substance. So if you eat okra, you know how okra can be sticky, that's mucilage. So this goo is presumably used to defend the plant from some herbivory, but it's just a really wild thing to encounter in nature. A plant that's just covered in goo. It's very slippery, it's not particularly sticky, it's cool stuff. So that's water shield. Simple oval leaves, no teeth, not particularly showy flowers. So this is white turtlehead. This is a plant that really likes wet soils. It grows on the edges of rivers and lakes and ponds. It's called turtlehead because the flower looks kind of like a turtle's head. There's not a whole lot to say about it in terms of food or habitat, other than that it's a native pollinator. You can get a Midwestern species pink turtlehead for your garden. It's got these elongated leaves with teeth on them, and it tends to grow, it can grow in shade or in the sun, but white turtlehead, really beautiful plant. We've got a couple of other really cool plants here growing right next to the water. So one of them is this beautiful orange flower here. It's bilaterally symmetrical. This is Joule Weed, also known as spotted touch-me-not. The reason it's called touch-me-not is that later in the season it produces these seed pods that have extremely tightly wound triggers in them, and when they're touched they should explode. Woo! Did you get that?
I got that.
Yeah, so you can see now sort of the stringy bits left behind by the explosion. That's called ballistic dispersal. So when you disturb the seed pods, it blasts out the seeds and disperses them. Joule weed is called Joule weed because if you submerge the leaves in water, water will pool on them. They're extremely hydrophobic, and the drops will look kind of like little jewels. The plant is extremely succulent looking. It's got a lot of moisture in it. This isn't a great example because it's so small, but these stems can get quite large. They have sort of red nodes, and if you break the stem open, you'll get a lot of liquid out of it. This is used as a remedy for poison ivy. So I've used this many times when I've walked through poison ivy. There are minerals in the juices in this plant that should supposedly neutralize or wash off the poison ivy oils. So it doesn't really cure poison ivy if you've got the rash already, but it should help to get rid of the oils if you've been exposed to them. So that's Joule weed, probably Impatiens pallida. Right next to it, we've got an aster. So asters are pretty hard to identify to species. You have to usually key them out and look at the flowers. But they're really cool plants. They tend to flower in the fall, so a lot of the flowers you see in the woods in the fall are asters. And what they produce is these very tricky looking flowers. So you probably think that this whole thing here is a flower, but in fact it is a complex of little flowers. There's two different categories of flower. There are disc flowers. Those are the minute flowers that make up the yellow center of this overall thing that looks like a big flower. And then there are ray flowers, and those are each of these individual petals. So each of these white petals is its own flower, and each of these little yellow dots is its own flower, disc and ray flowers. So it's very difficult to identify to species because, in fact, you need to pay attention to the structures of these very minute flowers. So this is probably whitewood aster, Eurybia divaricata. It has a stem that kind of zigzags from side to side a little bit. It tends to grow in the forest, and it has these big oval-shaped leaves, almost triangular in shape, really, with big exaggerated teeth. We've found a really cool scene here. A stone wall submerged by the beaver activity. So what this is really, first of all, stone walls in New England forests, we probably all know that this is evidence of the history of the area, the land use history of the area. It tells us that once upon a time these weren't forests. People weren't building stone walls going straight through the forest. They leveled the forest, and then they created farmland either for grazing or for raising crops. And because, as we know, New England's soils are full of rocks, as they tilled the land, they dug up the rocks and they moved them out of the way and created these beautiful stone walls that the region is so famous for. But what you don't see very often is stone walls going straight through a pond. And so obviously this wasn't built in a pond. It just didn't used to be a pond. And so this is showing you the evidence, the really dramatic evidence of the impact of beavers on this landscape. So we've got all these sedges, and we've got reeds growing in amongst the stone wall, all this aquatic vegetation. We've got some dead trees that have been drowned by the beavers, and just a really beautiful and remarkable landscape to enjoy. So this is three-way sedge, and the three-way bit about it is that if you look straight down the sedge, you'll see that its leaves line up in 1, 2, 3 ranks. So it's three-leaved sedge. It looks almost like a little bamboo, and it's very apparent in the environment around these wet areas. You see it all over the place, bundled up together with these really pointy leaves in ranks of 3. So that should be pretty obvious to the eye. We've just found a really cool plant. This is lady's tress. It is an orchid, and you can see that it's a single stalk covered in lots of little beautiful orchid flowers. There's not a lot to it in terms of vegetation, but it's a really beautiful plant, really special. It's an aquatic plant, and it's a carnivorous plant. Right down here, these little yellow flowers, it's called bladderwort. And that bladder part refers to the traps that it uses under the water to capture aquatic critters and digest them. And so carnivorous plants tend to grow in areas that are low in nutrients, and so their carnivory is how they get the nutrients that aren't available in the water or soil that they're growing in. And as you can see, they can still be really beautiful plants even though they're generally very small and don't have a lot in the way of leaves. So, bladderwort. It's growing here, floating on the surface of the water in what looks almost like something you could stand on, but it's really a floating mat. So we've got this other really cool plant here called blue-stemmed goldenrod. Blue-stemmed goldenrod is a goldenrod. There's many different goldenrods. They have these small yellow flowers. You see them often in fields. People think that they cause a lot of allergies, but they're really important, prominent flowers in North America. Also very difficult to identify the species, but blue-stemmed is a little easier because it grows in the forest, which is less common for a goldenrod. So there's not a lot of options in the woods. Most goldenrods grow in abundant sunlight, but this is growing in shade. And it has a sort of a dark stem, an almost bluish stem with this waxy coating on it that if you rub it kind of rubs off and the stem goes from being dark to a little bit lighter. So this is blue-stemmed goldenrod, really beautiful plant that you can appreciate in the fall in the woods.
Okay, that's the video. What do you guys think? I have no questions in the chat box. If you have any questions, you can type them in. Mike, can you tell me a little bit about the experience of making the video on that day? How did you choose what you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I think I mostly just, well, let me think about this. I scouted the location out ahead of time and took a lot of photos of different plants that I thought might be interesting. So I think I had some idea of things I wanted to cover because in the previous video that folks can find on YouTube, we covered a particular collection of plants, and I didn't want to be too duplicative. I think that video covered a lot more trees, and so really the highlight of a beaver habitat or any wetland edge is going to be more of the herbaceous plants, the flowering plants that are around. So I wanted to focus on those more so than the trees for this particular video. So a lot of it was, I had an array of things to choose from, and from there it was mostly haphazard.
So we do have a question. I'm curious to know if you are able to tell how long the beavers have been creating the dam and how long they will stay. And I know that's a tough question because we didn't really dive too much into investigating beavers specifically when we were out there.
I doubt even someone who studies beavers full time could tell just by looking at a pond unless they had been studying it. So the pattern for the most part for beavers is that they will occupy a location, they will exhaust the resources at the location, the food resources, and then they will abandon and move on. And then depending on where you are, beavers will re-inhabit and recolonize an area at particular intervals of time. So out in the western United States, in like Oregon, it could be 2 years on average, 2 to 3 years. In Wyoming, it's like 10 years. Up in the Adirondacks, it's 10 to 30 years. I don't know what it is in Connecticut specifically, but eventually they would probably come back because that location has a particular combination of features that make it an ideal habitat once the plants have regrown and the resources are there again. The other thing though to remember about Hartman, and I think this shows up on one of the maps that you included in the video, is that there are some human-made impoundments there as well, right? There's at least one earthen dam. So it's not as if the pond would totally disappear. It would certainly get smaller if the beavers abandoned, but.
Right, it was part of an old mill site and then the beavers expanded upon it.
Yeah.
And so we have a couple more questions coming in. Wendy Hill is the open space coordinator for the town of Lyme, and her formal duty is to manage and maintain the town properties, and Hartman Park is one of the town properties. And she says that the lodge in the beaver pond at Hartman was abandoned for about 5 years, and it's recently been re-inhabited over this past spring and summer now. So it's an active lodge again. And Bill Webb says that beavers love lily pads. So as long as there are lily pads there, they tend to stay. And Sheil would like to know how many beavers live in Hartman Park. I think that's tough to say. I think they kind of come and go. There's a couple of lodges there. And sometimes the juveniles, I believe, I'm not a wildlife biologist, but I believe the juveniles will stay with the family for up to a year, but then they're booted when the new, um, what are baby beavers called? Kits?
The
No,
young of the year, I
who
think.
knows?
So generally there'll be 6 beavers. There'll be this year's offspring, mom and dad, and then last year's offspring who are nearing the point where they're going to get kicked out of not just the lodge, but the territory in general.
Interesting.
But there's a lot of lodges at Hartman, and beavers are territorial, but it depends. The breadth of their territories it just depends on the resources available. So it could be that it probably is, because there's a lot of lodges at Hartman. There's probably several different families living there in their own territories.
And I think there are series of ponds too that kind of follow up the landscape, right? And so one thing that we had explored, Mike and myself and Wendy, we had explored for initially for doing this video was doing a video about the way the landscape is transformed when beavers come, before beavers, during beavers, and then after beavers, kind of exploring the way that the landscape changes from like a forest or a wetland into a pond and then back to a reforested landscape again. They really make dramatic impacts on the landscape. Maybe you can expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So again, this will depend a bit on where you are in the country, but in New England, certainly, beavers they're gonna so they don't necessarily need to build a dam. So there's in Deep River Post Cove, I won't say specifically where, but there's a beaver lodge in one of the banks of the cove. There's no sticks. It's just a hole under the water line that goes into the bank, and they have a burrow basically. So, and there's no dam there. It would be impossible to dam up what is a tidal section of the Connecticut River in a meaningful way. But so where they do build dams, it's generally going to be to improve an existing pond or section off a corner of a lake, or most of the time to impound a stream and create a pond. And there's lots of different factors that determine where they're likely to do this based on resources, based on the slope of the landscape around them and the size of the waterway, that they're trying to impound. So anyways, it kind of depends whether or not they're going to build a dam and how big the pond is going to end up getting. If the slope isn't too great, then they will probably over time try to expand the pond, both overall and by creating these little trenches that go into the woods as they're flooding the woods, so that they can access more food and building material away from the main pond. They don't want to get up out of the water and walk more than a couple yards away from the water, because they're very ungainly on land and vulnerable to attack. So if they have the opportunity and it makes sense on the landform, they'll expand the pond. They'll slowly kill off the trees and the woody plants. Not all of them, they have preferences, but a lot of the plants in Connecticut, a lot of the trees in Connecticut, they do like to eat. So they might leave the hickories alone, but they'll get the oaks and the maples and the ash and a bunch of other stuff. So they kill the trees both by flooding and then by cutting them down. And then once the resources are, and throughout this process, they're creating new habitat. There's an ecotone between the pond and the forest that's going to generally look like water, and then grasses and sedges, and then maybe some shrubs and short trees, and then the woods. And so they're moving this ecotone, and they're probably widening it. They're concentrating nutrients in the pond and then spreading those nutrients. They're accumulating silt. So they're changing the entire profile of the ecosystem that they're in. They're creating lots of opportunities for other animals and plants to come and take advantage of those new resources and the heterogeneity of those resources. And so they tend to increase the richness, so the species count, at least of plants around and in the pond over time. they're probably going to be they're probably not going to change the richness of mammals and amphibians necessarily and fish, but they'll certainly impact those things. And then eventually when they abandon, their dam may last on its own for a while, depending on how much how much flood surges, how often big surges of water come in and put pressure on the dam. The dam may last quite a long time before it eventually fills with holes and drains the pond. If it drains slowly, it will leave behind this relatively flat or sloped alluvial plain of silt and nutrients that is collected. If it drains quickly, then a lot of that's going to wash away. But if it leaves that behind, that's what will become a beaver meadow. And so once the water drains, you'll get grasses and sedges, and then eventually plants that can tolerate a little less moisture in the soil as the soil dries out. And so basically you get this slow succession from pond to mudflat to field to usually young forest and then older forest. And sometime at some point the beavers will come in and they'll start over again. Yeah, and there's some divergences there. So sometimes the field will stay a field. And in the 1800s, when farmers were expanding through New England, I was reading today that apparently some actually would target beaver meadows, beaver ponds, to convert them into meadows because they knew they'd be good for farming. So we would take advantage of those resources as well.
Interesting. I have inevitably found myself taking notes on what you're saying. Does anyone else have any questions for Michael while we have him? I must say that, once we are free and clear to convene again as groups, we hope to have some walks with Michael in the flesh, all of us together, going and walking and exploring with him, because it's truly an experience. But we're also very grateful that we can provide these video experiences in the meantime. Mary Guitar is curious to know if there are other kinds of native orchids, which is a cool question.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of native orchids. While I specialize in plants, I'm not super well versed in all the rare species. So I couldn't tell you how many orchids are in Connecticut or name them all or even identify them all. There's going to be a lot of orchid diversity in sort of unusual habitats. So dry habitats that are kind of sandy have a couple interesting orchids, and then very wet habitats could have a few interesting orchids that you might not see very often. Not salt marshes, but wet non-saline habitats, bogs and things. And then there's the orchids you probably see on most of Lyme Land Trust wooded preserves. You're most likely to see pink lady slipper, which I tend to see growing on kind of drier mounded areas or mounds in the woods, slopes in the woods, often under conifers. And then also rattlesnake plantain, which I think there's more than one species probably that could occur in Connecticut. And that's a very minute flower. You'd almost need a magnifying glass to really appreciate its orchid, characteristics. But
okay, well, we have a bunch of people thanking us for the wonderful presentation. We have a few minutes left. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that was a part of the video and helped us produce it. Lyme Land Trust obviously was the major supporter there, and then we had the assistance of Wendy Hill, who helped us guide us around Hartman Park, but she also did some videography for us, and she created some B-roll. She used a gyroscope on an iPhone and did some fancy stuff. It was really awesome content. And Joe Standart, I'm not sure if he's with us here tonight, but Joe Standart is a nationally recognized photographer and also has a little bit of videography in his skill set. So he was very helpful in the production of this video. And we are just so grateful for everybody and for Michael. And we thank everybody for joining us. This presentation was recorded this evening, and we will share the link on our website, and I will try and email it to the group as well so that you can refer back to it or watch it again. And again, you should also have an email from me that I sent in the middle of the video with a link to the video just itself, the Beaver Pond Ecology video. If you want to just watch that or share it with your friends, we'll also be posting that publicly. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michael, for joining us this evening.
Thank you for including me.
Sure. We'll have a great night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.